We are going to be in the Old Testament this morning, the book of 1 Samuel, and we're going to be in chapter 3. So 1 Samuel chapter 3 is our spot today. My passion as a servant of the kingdom is to make God real and applicable to your life. I mean, the way I look at it, there's a couple of ways, at least, to relate to God. You can do it formally, or you can do it personally. Now, formally, I would define as, following the rules, being polite, kind of the military model, which for many years kind of was mine, because there's no ambiguity. You do what you're told. It's kind of like being married, do what you're told and life's good. And I think sometimes that we deal with God that way. It's like, give me the rules, tell me what to do, tell me where to go and how to do it. Matter of fact, I was in class one time and the professor asked us to solve a problem, and I said, okay, well, how? And he says, well, you decide. Like, no, that's not how it works. You just tell me what to do and then I do it. And so many of us are just kind of sitting there puzzled, looking at one another like we don't know how to handle this on our own. And I think that's how a lot of people are. When it comes to God, they, give me the rules, tell me what to do, tell me how to do it, tell me how much I enjoyed it, and then, I'll move on from there. And that's kind of the informal way. Or there's a personal way of dealing with God, like you would deal with, one another. The relationship manner of coming to God. But we really have a problem when we think of relating to God as we relate to other people, because we're quick to point out that God's not like other people. Matter of fact, God's like no other person. So the idea of being able to be in a relationship with Him, though we use that term, we struggle with what that means and how that looks in our life. So my hope over the next few weeks is to begin to lay a foundation for you that if you tend to deal with God in an informal religious basis, that you might see some open doors to move to a more familiar relational way. Because that's God's desire for you. God's desire for every person is that they would have a personal relationship with Him. And I don't throw that out there in the term of, to get saved. That's part of it. Getting saved is part of it. But God wants to have an ongoing, vital, personal relationship with everybody. And we need to recognize that. Because like any relationship, they go two ways. Lily Tomlin said one time, why is it that when we talk to God, we call it prayer, but when God talks to us, we call it schizophrenia? But that God evidences in the Scripture a back and forth didactic relationship where we speak to Him and He speaks to us. And so that's the direction that we're launching off of today here out of 1 Samuel 3. If you're familiar with this passage, this kind of introduces to the biblical scene the person of Samuel, who would rise to be one of the greatest prophets and the last of the judges. He kind of serves as a transitional figure in the life of Israel. As a matter of fact, it notes right there, in verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli, and the word from Yahweh was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. This was a time of transition in Israel's life. And they were kind of moving from this sense of being a group of people scattered throughout the land to being a community of God's people, of being Israel the nation, the hoped for priests to the world. So it's a transition time from the period of the kings into the period of the prophets, and God begins to relate to them a little bit differently, and we'll see how that transition takes place. So we're introduced to this young boy, Samuel. Okay, you remember his mother Hannah had prayed for a child, and she was barren for so many years, and she finally got pregnant, and she told God, you give me a kid and I'll give him to you. And sure enough, when Samuel was born, she took him to the temple and handed him over to Eli and said, Eli, raise this young man as a child in the Lord. And so here we come to one of those days in the life of Samuel. It says in verse 2 that it happened at that time, as Eli was lying down in his place, Now his eyesight had begun to grow dim and he could not see well. Those kind of seem to go together, right? If your eyesight grows dim, you probably can't see well. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Now they've set up the temple, there are the tabernacle, and Eli's caring for the lamp. It's late in the day. He's getting ready to go to bed. And then it said that it was at that time that the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here I am." Then he ran to Eli, he being Samuel, ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Samuel said to him, "I didn't call you. Go lay down." I wonder if it was something more like, "Get out of here, boy, you're bothering me. You know, I'm trying to get some sleep. Go lie down." So Samuel went and lay down. Then Yahweh called again, "Samuel." And so Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli answered again, "I did not call you, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had the word of the Lord yet been revealed to him. You need to make note of that. It said at this point, Samuel hadn't yet heard the voice of Yahweh. It hadn't yet been revealed to him. So Yahweh called to Samuel again for the third time, and he arose and he went to Eli and he said, "Here I am, for you called me yet again." Then Eli discerned that Yahweh was calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, "Go and lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you shall say, 'Speak, Yahweh, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Then Yahweh came and stood and gathered as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And then it goes on to kind of unfold to this young boy, if you will, a message that he was to deliver to the nation of Israel and his place in God's relationship with him. But this interchange is very interesting. First of all, you can just mark this off as the, mad ramblings of some biblical writer and say, let's move on to something else. And a lot of people do that. Okay? They just kind of gloss over this and say, well, that's an exceptional thing. It may be, it may be not. Well, I'm telling you it is. This actually happened. That one day this young man in the temple, minding his own business, doing what he had committed to doing, is interrupted by God in a way that he had never known before. And it's laid out there before us that in this encounter between Yahweh and Samuel, that God speaks and Samuel responds. So you've got to understand, you've just got to accept, you've got to write down, nail it down, however it takes for you to understand. You need to recognize that it's God's desire to express Himself to humanity. Not just through feelings and emotions, not just through circumstance and speculation, but that God wishes to speak to humanity. I'm going to give you a moment for that to sink in. Okay? Because I think inherently all of us have kind of come to the point where we say, well, yeah, God did speak. And maybe we look at this and we go, well, that was then, but this is now. But understand that as you march through the Scriptures, there is no indication anywhere that desire of God to communicate with people has stopped. But yet it seems that in our time, we have accepted that God's preferred method of communication is either A, through feelings, or B, through another person. So you'll go to church and you'll say, oh wow, God really spoke to me today. Okay? Now I'm going to assume that something was said, something was heard, that touched you in a way that kind of registered with you, and you took that as God speaking. Now maybe it wasn't that at all. Maybe God spoke to you in another way and I'm misunderstanding it. But in all the years that I've been a believer, most of the folks that I know, when they speak about God talking to them, they really kind of refer to it as a feeling, something they read, or something somebody said. Not always that sense of God really moving upon them in a way independent of another person. Now, let me backtrack and say, I don't mean to diminish the Word of God, and I don't mean to diminish what a teacher or a preacher might say, and I don't mean to diminish feelings. I just want to add to it the reality that God can speak. That God is quite adequate to let His voice be known. I mean, I like to talk to people and they'll say, oh my gosh, what if I miss the will of God in my life? And I go, whoa, time out, hold on. Are you really looking for the will of God in your life? And they go, yes. Then you won't miss it. Well, how can you be sure? Because God's quite adequate to make Himself known. Okay? God's got enough to Him that if you're really listening for Him, you're not going to miss Him. But I just wonder if we haven't dismissed to the days of Moses and Noah and Adam and all of the rest of those, pre-Christ figures, this idea that God could really speak to a person. But yet the testimony of Scripture is that God speaks. There's a book out now, and Sharon, forgive me, I keep forgetting the name of it. Is it Jesus Calling? Is that it? That's out there. It's a popular devotional guide, and this woman wrote this devotional guide, and in it she shares things that God has spoken to her. And there are Christians out there that say, stay away from it, it's dangerous. Because God doesn't speak today. You're going to have to get past Joel chapter 3 for that one, where God says in the last days old men will see vision and young men will dream dreams. God still speaks. And we desperately need it. Matter of fact, we desperately need it because there's a lot of kooks out there that claim to speak for God and we're listening to them. I hate it when somebody says, God spoke to me. And you know what? Usually when they speak, it's like you can't eat something. Like God told me don't eat a hamburger. Well, brother, God told you to not eat a hamburger. Leave me alone. Give me something substantive. Give me something that God really spoke. But we seem to accept any little thing from somebody else because we don't believe that we can experience God speaking to us. Now, before you think, well, get on the phone, call 911, Jim's losing it. Okay? I have never heard God speak in a booming voice out of heaven. Okay? I've never had a bush burst into fire before me. Okay? Now, Moses did. Okay? Noah did. But that's Moses and Noah. But God has spoken to me. Well, how do you know it was God? Well, what did Jesus say? The sheep know the shepherd's voice? I just knew His voice. Well, was it audible? Well, to me it was. I heard it. It's God speaks. But He doesn't speak to everybody in the same way that He speaks to somebody. Because if a bush burst into flames in front of me, I would try to put it out. Okay? We're in the desert. We don't like fire here. If God spoke to me in a booming voice, I'd look for an overhead speaker. He's going to speak to us in ways that are particular to us and in a way that we're going to recognize because He doesn't want us to wig out. He wants us to hear Him, to commune with Him. But we have somehow imagined that it is impossible that God could speak to me. God could speak to Moses, God could speak to Noah, God could speak to Adam, God could speak to Pastor Jim, but God could never speak to me. God's speaking to a 12, 13-year-old boy here. Why couldn't He speak to you? You've got to accept that God speaks, or you'll never, ever have the hope of hearing Him. I was talking to a lady one time, and I said, what if God told you to do this? And I gave her something that I knew was really particularly important to her, and I went the other way with it. And she said, oh, God would never do that. Yeah, He wouldn't, because if He did, you wouldn't think it was God. If we don't believe that God can speak, if God speaks, we go, oh, that was just my imagination. Oh, that was just this. Oh, that was just that. We find some other excuse rather than learning to say, you know what? Wow, that was God. God's spoken to my life. Now, I know that this makes you a little bit nervous because you go, well, what if somebody comes to me and says, God told me to burn down the church? God told me to kill my neighbor. God told me to eat my dog, Well, understand that God's not going to speak in a way that's inconsistent with the way He has spoken. He's not going to tell you to do something that He says you shouldn't do. But He is going to speak. And if you're not willing to open your mind up to the possibility that God speaks, then I'm afraid you're always going to have to get a postcard. You know, it comes by way of somebody else. Not only do you need to understand that God speaks, as we see here, but that it is revealed with Samuel and God, God means for it to be a two-way relationship. What did Eli say? Listen, when you hear God speak, you answer. Okay? Now, this is not a conversation, right? No, this is not a conversation. And whenever I try to make it a conversation, y'all look at me, because this isn't supposed to be a conversation. Well, you ask a question, but it's rhetorical. A conversation is, I speak, I shut up, you speak, you shut up, we go back and forth. That's how God intends for it to be. Remember in the garden, God's walking along, Adam, where are you? And Adam nudges Eve and says, shut up. Just listen to him. Well, he probably said that because he was hiding, you know? God expects that when He speaks, we're going to reciprocate. Is that not the nature of any relationship? You know, you come home, hi honey, how's work today? And she doesn't say anything. You go, oh great, really marvelous. Glad it was so well, you know, how are the kids doing? Oh, fantastic to hear. No, there's a give and take. Eli says to Samuel, when God speaks, should you not respond? Keep your finger here in 1 Samuel, and I want you to go over to 1 Kings chapter 19. Go to the right a couple of books. 1 Kings 19. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. This deals with the situation involving Elijah, Jezebel, and God. Elijah's just come down off of the mount and his encounter with the prophets of Baal. You remember that? You know, they're kind of ridiculing Yahweh and Baal's better, and God and Elijah says, "Oh yeah, well let's put them to the test." And so they construct an altar and they, you know, have them sacrifice a bull, put it on there, and do all that they're going to do, and nothing happens. No fire comes down. Baal does not show up. Okay? Then Elijah does the same thing, constructs the altar, digs a trench around it, you know, pours water on it, and stands back and says, show him you're great, God. Boom! Sacrifices burned up, altars burned up, all the water's licked up. Great demonstration of God's presence and power. Right after that, Elijah goes on the lam because Jezebel hears about the death of her prophets, and she sets out after Elijah. So Elijah says, I'm out of here. So he goes and runs off, and says in verse 1 of chapter 19, now Ahab had told Jezebel, Ahab was Jezebel's husband, all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me, and even more, if I do not make your life as like the life of one of those by this time tomorrow. And he was afraid, Elijah, and he arose and he ran for his life, came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servants there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and he sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested of himself that he might die, and said, it's enough now, Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. He lay down, he slept under the juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water, and he ate, and he drank, and he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time, and touched him, and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. And he arose, and he ate, and he drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then he came there to a cave, and he lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said to him, Yahweh said to Elijah, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord, and behold, Yahweh passed by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountain, breaking it to pieces, and the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a sound of a gentle blowing. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a mantle, and he went out, and he stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altar, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. What I like so much about that is what you do not get when you read it. You do not get the emotion. You know, God asked the same question twice, and Elijah gives the same answer twice, but the circumstances are different. The first time, what's the theological word I'm looking for? Wigged out. That's it. Wigged out. Elijah is wigging out. Okay? He is running for his life. And God says, Elijah, what's going on? Ah, they're here to get me! And he says, come outside. Let's have a talk. And God parades himself by and then says, Elijah, what are you doing here? And now Elijah, in a calm state, says, Lord, this is what's going on. An encounter with God is meant to be didactic, and it's meant to change you. And that is so witnessed there in that encounter with Yahweh and Elijah. He engaged God. He connected with God, and it changed his outlook. The circumstance didn't change, but Elijah changed. That is a quintessential example of what God is looking for when he says we need to talk, that you might know me and who I am, and there might be a change of you as a result. Now let me explain something. Remember I said you could deal with God informally and you could follow the rules, but the rules don't change you. The rules only change your behavior. Or you can relate to God personally and God will change you. And as a consequence, your behavior will change. Which do you suppose God's really after? Not rhetorical. He wants to change you. He doesn't want to just change your actions. He wants to change you. So here we see with Samuel and with God that they're encountering one another for the first time, and Samuel's life is being shaped and altered. He's not just merely talking to God and getting marching orders, which I sometimes think is what we imagine when we think about praying. We go to God and we say, God, okay, God, what do you want? Okay? And then we listen. Right? Or, here's this situation, God. You know, what do you want to do? Or, you know, we ask, do this in that situation, then we listen. That's innately legalistic. Because we're just listening for directions. We're not talking to God and saying, hey God, how's it going? What are you doing here today, Jim? Got nothing, just want to talk. You ever done that with God? Got nothing to, there's no big problem, there's no big issue. I just want to talk. You ever had a friend call you up and do that? Y'all have a friend? Okay, all right. We're listening. You ever have a friend call you up and you go, what's wrong? And they go, I just want to hear your voice. Why wouldn't we do that with God? How do you suppose it impacts God when the only time He hears from His children are when they need something? It's kind of like a college student and their parents, you know. Hey, what's going on? Oh, I'm out of money. You know. Well, call me again. Yeah, when I'm out of money. You know, that's kind of what we do to God. Lord, I got a problem I need to talk to you about. Well, I mean, God's glad to hear that, you know. But if that is the essence of your communication with God, then you've got a sliver going. And there's a whole bunch you're missing. Communication with God, talking with God, conversing with God is not merely about seeking direction. It's not merely about tell me what to do or tell me what's going to happen. It's about experiencing who God is as an individual. It's about allowing Him access to your life and to change you as a person. And that doesn't just happen by telling me what to do. That happens in the unfolding of a relationship over the course of a lifetime. We've got to understand that when God says, I want to have a relationship with you, it's not about just hearing from Him, do this, do that, do these, do those. It's about the mingling of a life together. And the basic way that humanity does that is by communicating. Whether that be verbally, through sign language, through letters. That's how we connect with other people. So why would it be any different that we must connect and communicate with God? You with me so far? The only problem with that we see here is that communicating with God's kind of wild. It's not something that, you know, I'm naturally familiar with. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about it to them. Says, you know, the natural mind and the mind of God aren't always on the same page. Here with Eli and Samuel and God, we see Eli pulling Samuel aside and saying, okay, listen, this is how it works. This is how you talk with God. Samuel didn't even consider that God might speak to him. So Eli says to him, that's God speaking, and this is how you respond. We need to be taught how to communicate with God. I don't mean the words, dear Goddeth, thank you for this dayeth. You know, put marbles in your mouth, it helps, you know. I love when you ask somebody to pray. Well, I can't pray like so-and-so. If I wanted so-and-so to pray, I would ask him to pray. You know, I want you to pray. I want you to, in your own words. It's not that. It's okay, I'm communicating with the God of the universe. What does that mean? And that is where we're going to go from here. We need to learn how to commune and to communicate with God. We need to learn how it is that He speaks. Because you know what? Though God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, how He speaks to you and to you and to you will differ from one another and from how He speaks to me. How? I didn't say what. I said how. Because there are certain things that I will respond to, and there are certain things that you will respond to. And they're not always the same. And God's end goal is He wants you to hear Him. So He's going to come to you in a way that you know. But you've got to learn to listen to it. The first step in learning is to realize that God speaks. And that He wants an answer. You ever get that as a kid? You know, your parent comes to you, says, listen, boy, what do you think you were doing? Well, Dad, if I want you to talk, I'll tell you to talk. Well, you asked me, shut up, you know. And sometimes I think God does that, you know. God wants an answer. So we need to learn that, well, okay, God speaks. And God answers. And in the course of that exchange, you and I learn to recognize the distinctiveness of God's voice. Kind of like an instrument. I admire people like Ken that can take a guitar and tune it by ear. Sounds good to me. I like Terry's approach. He's got a cheat. You know, it's a little instrument on his guitar, and he just watches the thing. But Ken sits there and goes, ding, 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 ding. Oh, there it is, ding, 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 ding. That's how it is with God. You learn to recognize the pitch, the tone, the very rhythm of God's voice to you. Because the reality is this. If you're a child of God, He has spoken to you, and you have heard Him, and you have responded to it. You just don't necessarily realize it was God. We need to learn how to recognize God's voice. So how do we do that? Well, one we see right here with Eli, you learn from those who know God's voice. I mean, hang out with people that know God's voice. Now, I don't mean you hang out with people that say, well, you know, I've talked with God. Jim Jones said he talked with God. Charles Manson said he talked with God. I mean, I'm talking about people who really evidence the character of God. And you learn from them. And if you're a person who has a communicative relationship with God, it is upon you to disciple others in learning how to speak, in learning how to speak with God. Because this is the essence of a relationship with God. If there is no communication, what is the quality of the relationship? Probably not too good. So we need to learn from other people. Those who have experienced that. Like Eli taught Samuel how to recognize God's voice. Those who know God's voice, it's obvious. Because you see the character of God in them. They're not necessarily religious people, but you see the character of God in them. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, you know, maybe they don't carry the Bible that somebody says they ought to carry. Maybe they don't go to church every time somebody says they ought to go to church. But the evidence of God's character is in them. I have a friend of mine, he decided that they weren't going to do church on Sunday night. Okay? I know, we haven't done it the whole time I've been here. But this was big for them. We're going to have church on Sunday night. People had a fit. Other pastors, I can't believe they're not having church on Sunday night. And I said, you want to know what they're doing? Oh, they're probably sitting home watching football. No, they're going out to nursing homes. They're going out and helping people in their neighborhood. They're having small groups. So maybe they don't do what a religious establishment says they ought to do, but the character of God is evident in these people. Look for them. Talk to them. Learn from them about what it means to walk with God. Another thing to consider is you got to spend time with God. Praying once a week is not sufficient. Okay? It's just not. Praying over your meal is just not sufficient. Talking all of the time in prayer is not sufficient. But you need to spend time with God learning to listen. Sometimes that comes through His Word. You sit and you read and you say this, try this, this is wild. I mean, we're talking revolutionary. Read something and say, God, help me to see something in here that applies to my life. And you know what will happen? He'll show up. I guarantee you. I guarantee you. If He does it, then you come to me and talk, and we'll figure out why. How do I know that works? Because every time I approach the Word, that's how I do it. And if I do it in sincerity, He always shows up. Now, I'm not saying He always shows up, because sometimes I'm not right. But every time I do it in sincerity, God shows up. So I know it works. The last thing is this. The last thing I'm going to mention. Look for others that seem to know the voice of God. Spend time with God. And then root yourself in His Word. Remember what I said earlier? God is not going to speak out of character. He may act in a way that you're unfamiliar with. But God is not going to act in a way that is unfamiliar as He has revealed Himself. And that's what the Bible's all about. So God's not going to tell you something that's contrary to the Word, to what He's already said. He's not going to tell you to do something that's contrary to the life of Jesus. Because Jesus is the revelation of God. Okay? So if you want to learn to recognize God's voice, well, how about taking a look at how He has spoken before? And that will help you to recognize it as He speaks to you now. I understand that, you know, there's a lot here. And we're going to unpack this in the course of the next, couple of months. But it's important. Because if you do not commune with God, You may be really good on the outside, but your inner person is going to shrivel up. You need to learn to commune with God. And that's my heart's passion for you, is that you would commune with God. Because I understand that if you're communicating with God, you're going to be exactly what He wants you to be. And I'm okay with that. Because that's all I want for you anyway. All right? We good? Let's pray.